So I'm going to be on this. I'm going to do my best to respect Bob's time on this tag team presentation. But the question that was posed to us was, why is cow longevity and maternal performance important? And I think that question the answer to that question is very obvious to this audience, and it's because both of those have a huge contribution to the profitability of the cow-calf enterprise. And so, it's already been mentioned this morning about the whole issue of sustainability, and the three pillars of sustainability being economic, social, and environmental. And unfortunately, the media and society as a whole, I think, gives more preference to the environmental and especially the social aspect of sustainability. But everybody in this room realizes that obviously, if we're not economically sustainable, then we're not sustainable as an industry or as an enterprise. And so both of those have a huge contribution to cow-calf profitability and sustainability of that enterprise. Why would a guy from Texas put a longhorn from Texas A&M put a longhorn on the screen this morning? I did it, and I thought about it as I was on the flight conducting. I thought, that wasn't a very good choice, because to put this cow on the screen for this audience probably sucks the air out of the room as we think about Beef Improvement Federation meetings. But I did it primarily for two reasons. Everybody has a cow longevity story, and this one is mine. A producer that I worked with when I lived in far west Texas, worked that area, longhorn breeder out there. This cow was 25 years old and just weaned about 6 weeks prior to this, and just weaned her 23rd calf. As we think about longevity, that's pretty significant. You look at her udder quality, you look at her conformation, she's still holding together pretty well. But the point of this one was, and I wanted to make sure, and it goes without saying to get in this audience, environmental adaptability is huge. I appreciate Jared's comments that started this morning's program. Environmental adaptability is huge. Most of my career has been working with beef cattle, some with sheep and goats, but with range livestock in environments where nutrition is typically the first limiting factor. And so environmental adaptability, as demonstrated by this cow, as demonstrated by the cows with longevity and all of your herds and all of your programs, again, is absolutely huge. We split this up, and I'm going to do just a very brief, make some very brief comments about the business or financial side of this presentation. And then, as has already been mentioned, Bob's going to follow up with the genetics and the production aspects of longevity and its importance in a cow-calf enterprise. As we think about expenses, to think about the profitability equation being total income minus total expenses, and the expenses being the side of that equation over which we as producers, we as cow-calf operators have the greatest control. The results of the studies that our students do working in ranches across the country would say that these four typically always show up in the top 4 or 5 in terms of ranch expenses. Pasture costs, whether that's purchase price, lease price, whatever that might be, pasture cost or forage cost is huge. Supplemental feed and hay is also a significant expense in most of our operations. And then I shaded the last two a little bit differently to include labor and depreciation, whether that's ownership compensation or whether that's hired labor in the form of managers, cowboys, whatever the case might be. Those two, the top two are typically cash costs. The bottom two are non-cash costs. I'm just going to adjust here. Is it too loud? No. How can I see?
Is that better in the back?
Is that better? Good.
Okay.
I got a thumbs up from Donald Brown. That means it's good. If Donald can hear me, everybody can hear me, right? Okay. The bottom two, typically non-cash costs, and that's going to come back to play here when we talk about expenses from the numbers that we're going to use from counterfacts numbers. So depreciation is the one that I want to focus on this morning. I'm not going to bore you with definitions. I just put this up there. The Farm Financial Standards Council of the city is a definition that most of us use in agriculture, and they define depreciation as the allocation of the expenses that reflects the using of certain business assets employed by the entity. In this case, we're talking about that business asset being the cow. There's tax appreciation, which all of us can appreciate, which the goal, and that is to reduce the income, and that's entered on the schedule F line 14, that reduction of taxable income. But the one that I want to focus on is to manage that depreciation, which is a systemic approach to providing an accurate assessment of net worth and fuel adjusted income. In other words, we're trying to do a good job with the P&L, the balance sheet, to figure out, are we accumulating wealth in a cow-calf enterprise and a ranching enterprise, or are we eroding assets? The last thing that I've already mentioned is, it is a non-cash cost. We don't write a check at the end of the year, end of the month, end of the pay period. We don't write a check for depreciation, but it's a very real cost in these enterprises. The other thing I was hesitant to do is to jump off into math in a room as a nutritionist in a room full of animal breeders and geneticists. I knew better than that, but I couldn't help it when we came to depreciation. So it's a very simple formula. Whether you're purchasing females or whether you're raising your own, if you're purchasing those females, then depreciation is obviously the purchase price minus the salvage value divided by the useful life. In our program, we typically use 5 years. That's typically what's used for the tax depreciation. So that's what I used here. If we're raising our own replacement females, then it'd be that book value whenever you capitalize those sectors into that cow-calf enterprise minus that salvage value, again divided by the 5 years. So I just came up with an example. I realize this example probably doesn't fit anybody, any operation represented in the room, but I came up with an example to demonstrate the impact that depreciation has and consequently the contribution that longevity makes. So I assume the purchase price of a 2-year-old red female would be $2,500. Salvage value of $950, and immediately everybody in the room recognizes that given today's packer cow prices, that's probably too cheap. But I had to have something that was defendable, so I just went back, as the footnote says, and took a 2-year rolling average of the Califax canner cover cow average price, and that's how I came up with the $950, 1,150 pound cow, packer cow times the $82 per hundredweight. So that gives us, then we look at the useful life. We take initial price minus salvage value and divide that by 5. We come up with depreciation of $310 per cow per year over that 5-year depreciation period. Sounds like a lot, but there's even more, probably even more radical examples. If we go back to some of the prices that were paid for females in the 2011, 12, 13 time period, 14 and 15 in that period when we were coming out of the severe drought. There's even more radical examples than that. So $310 in annual depreciation per cow over that 5-year depreciation period. The other thing that we need is an estimate of unit cost of production, and to calculate unit cost of production, we've got to have cow cost. So I just went back to the most recent Califax data that was published in April this year, looked at the Southeast region, and for 2023, the most recent number, they have the Califax reported annual cow cost was $647. The thing that's important to remember about that particular cost, as it says over there, is it doesn't include non-cash costs. The 2 biggest of those would be the depreciation and return to ownership or compensation of ownership for their labor. So we're going to use the $647. We're going to add the depreciation, which is not included in the Califax data, to come up with an annual cow cost of $950 for the sake of this demonstration. So what you have across the top then is, I'll move over here where I can read it off the computer screen. Had while I'm not taking my glasses, I can read it even better. So we've got across the top, and I'll show this to you in a graphic form here in just a minute. There's cow age across the top from 2 to 9. The cow cost in starting with that red 2-year-old starting this year in our assumption of $950. We escalated that 4% annually to try to make it as realistic as possible. And then we come up with the unit cost of production, which across the bottom of that table, and again, we're assuming, just a bit very generic, 85% calf crop. Wean is a function of the number of cows exposed to, for breeding, and an average weaning weight of 500 pounds across that horizon. So you see that we start in year one with a unit cost of production of $2.24 a pound, and it escalates up into the year 6 at $2.61 a pound. But then after that 6th year, after that, at age 6, after that 5th calf, that cow drops off. She's paid her depreciation, she drops off the depreciation schedule. And so we get a reset in years 7, 8, and 9, where that cow doesn't have to, no longer has to satisfy that depreciation. So I put this in a graphic form just to make it a little bit more easy to appreciate for those that are visual learners. So again, we get that reset, and that's a huge contribution in the latter years of production in terms of unit cost of production for that cow. What is the practical application of that? We all know that as those cows get beyond that prime of life, ages 7, 8, 9, depends on what environment you're in and what breed maybe that you're working with. But we know that typically as those cows get older, production falls off. But the point of this is we can keep those cows in the herd as long as their productivity is average or above. It's kind of the general thing that we accept in our program. So if her production in years 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, if she's still at or above the average for the herd, she deserves to stay because of her lower unit cost of production for a weaned calf. My final slide, I put up an illustration that came out of a project that we did with Lee Leachman. Lee has developed a fertility index, and he was very gracious to come to us and say, I think I've got a student for your project for your students to work on. He said, I've got this fertility index that we're coming up with, and he kind of helped us realize what it was about, kind of somewhat like stayability, but not exactly the same thing. He said, I need to put a value to fertility. So we put a team of students on this. Nathan Clackham, who's here, just recently graduated from the program, with Caroline Bob, who graduated last year from the program. We charged them with this, and here's what Lee would like to have. Come up with some way to put a value on fertility. So what they came up with was they used depreciation, and they basically calculated what they call, and this is not economically correct at all, I'm sure, for the economists in the room, but they came up with basically with a depreciation credit or a deduction. And so what this graph represents is a year having weaned 5 calves as the base of 0. And so as cows move beyond weaning a 5th calf, they were given depreciation credits. If they exited the herd in this illustration, they just set up a mock group of 100 cows. They assumed a 13% fallout rate every year, so it was a 1 strike and they're out program. And they assumed about 13% of those cows would exit the herd. They went through 10 parities, and the thing that was interesting was of that original group of 100 cows that started assuming 13% fallout every year, there was only 28 of those cows left. And over that 10-year parity period of time, those 100 cows weaned a sum total of 500 calves. And so that's that average there in the middle. And so again, as they move beyond that average, they increase their longevity. They are more fertile and stay in the herd. They begin to receive those depreciation credits, kind of an oxymoron. But that was how they came up with basically a way to put a dollar value on fertility and longevity. So again, very simple, straightforward. The longer these cows stay in the herd and they be productive at or above the average for the herd, the more profitable those cows can be. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and let him wrap up with the genetic and production side of that equation. You can keep your glasses.
I keep my glasses.
Yeah.
Great, well, thanks, Greg, and it's a real pleasure to have you here and share this topic with you, and I always appreciate both Greg and his former, I guess still colleague, but former partner in KR, and Mike Mathis's look on the production economics of our business. So, my job is really to talk about not only the genetic aspect, but some of the production aspects associated with improvement in cow performance from a maternal perspective, and longevity. And I'm gonna warn you, there's nothing in here that's rocket science, okay? I thought this would be a great opportunity to highlight some of the basic principles that sometimes we forget and overlook. We make things complicated. And so, as we think about building better cows, we need to think about the big rock things that we can get incorporated. From a commercial cow-calf perspective, of course, most of us in the room will recognize that it's the phenotype of that cow and her performance from a maternal aspect that pays the bills, right? It's not necessarily just her genetics, it's a combination of genetics and environment, our management, that manifests into a cow unit that makes sense. And so if we think about the genetics of that cow, we can partition that into at least two categories, the additive and the fits. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools from BPD or selection index approach that we might think about for particularly adaptation. So there's EPDs for things like cow size, growth, milk that affects adaptability or adaptation of cows to a particular production environment, and then traits associated with longevity. We also need to think about, from the commercial perspective, the value of the non-additive contribution to that animal's genetic portfolio, and particularly in terms of heterosis and recomplementarity. So thinking about how do we combine breeds in the most optimal way to both capture those heterotic effects, but also some of the traits we may need in terms of, say, tick or bug resistance or heat stress, those sort of things. Okay. And then at the bottom here, we can't overlook the impact of our management. And I use environment to describe not only the natural environment that we put a cow in, but certainly in production agriculture, we make modifications to that environment in terms of supplemental feedstuffs, artificial insemination, breeding programs, all kinds of things we do to manipulate that cow's production environment. So we have to take that into context as well. And I'm reminded often of, we get really tunnel vision when you're a geneticist on genetics. But at the end of the day, when we think about the commercial space, remembering that there's some of these environmental effects that dramatically influence the productivity of a cow over her lifetime. And some of them related clear back to, ideas like when that heifer was born and the calf drop in your production system. Okay. And so we'll talk a little bit about a couple of those just to remind us. I like little numeric examples. And so here's one just to kind of, I think it's always important to remember how many dollars are at play, right? And so let's think about just changing percent calf crop mean. Obviously an increase in revenue, so even a modest increase of say 7%, so going from an 83 to a 90% calf crop mean, that's 7 additional calves, even if they're not very big calves at 5 weight current prices. That's $10,000 on 100 cows. Okay, pretty soon it turns into real money, right? So we need to think about how that impacts not only gross revenue on the operation, but put it in context from a managerial accounting perspective. And thinking about either direct contribution to revenue enhancement or decreases in break-even unit cost of production. Of course, we can also think about, well, how do we add additional value from a breed complementarity standpoint or our breeding system to make environmentally adapted cows and market targeted calves. And so there's the old adage that, pounds pay, right? That's the main driver in calculating revenue for a cow-calf operation, pounds of calf meat. But if you make those additional pounds also high quality pounds, and we can describe quality lots of different ways. It adds value. Okay. I think it's interesting sometimes to think about and contrast the non-additive and additive components of our selection programs. So for a trait like heifer pregnancy, sometimes we get really focused on the heifer preg EPD, which in the long run is probably an important metric for us to think about. But it takes a long time to move a population very far in a trait like heifer pregnancy because of the low heritability. I can move it a lot in one generation by implementing an appropriate crossbreeding system. Okay, and so those are contrasted here. 7% change in first dose conception rate via heterosis or heifer pregnancy from that side is about 5% on heifer preg. If we do that, try and do that via selection, that means we need to add about 8 points to heifer preg EPD, and that moves you from the middle of the breed. You got to move the whole population of your cow herd basically to the top of the breed. Okay, how long is that going to take? Right. So think about these in terms of time scale. Well, longevity is a similar story. We know from the literature, heterosis improves cow longevity about 16% or about a year and a half productive life. If we think about a trait like stability, how long effectively do we have to, how much improvement in stability do we need to do that? So math I did a while back said about 90% increase, a 9-point move in stability. That goes from in Red Angus at that time, the slide's a couple of years old. You went from the middle of the breed to the top 1% of the breed to get that 9-point gain. Okay, that means you got to move your whole herd so that it averages as good as the top 1% of the breed. How long is that going to take? Right. So again, contrasting these ideas with the time scale is really important. The other piece here is thinking about how do we make these environmentally adapted cows? And when the program committee came to us last fall from the host group here, they wanted to focus around this idea of making better cows or building better cows, which I got really excited about because that speaks to a lot of things that I'm interested in. And central to that idea of adaptation is making sure that these females work in terms of nutrient requirement in their production environment. Okay, so we have tools to do that, right? Some of them aren't perfect. Some of them need a lot more data, but we can select for cow size and lactation to make those cows more fit in their production environment. Aside from the fitness part though, cow inventory is really important, right? If you think about a driver from a farm ranch accounting perspective, a driver of profit is stocking rate, right? Your stock density. How many cows can I run on my operation? Well, that's obviously very connected to cow size, right? So we know big cows eat more than small cows. So as we increase cow size to maintain our nutrient resource and meet nutrient requirements, we have to change the inventory of cows. And that negatively often impacts the net revenue. Okay, we know that different sized cows have dramatically different nutrient requirements. I'm really looking forward to Dr. Lallman's talk here after the break around this particular discussion point. We go from a relatively small 1,000-pound cow with low milk to a big high milk cow, about a 43% increase in nutrient requirement using the NRC. Okay. That means if we have a fixed resource base, we got to run a lot fewer cows. Okay, and I've got a whole talk. We can spend an hour. Okay. We know then that we overstock a little bit and we don't provide supplemental feed stuff. What happens to the cows? Body condition goes down, right? And I saw my colleague and friend, Dr. Johnson, earlier in Sandy, when we know we put cows in compromised position from body condition score, postpartum interval elongates, it gets longer, reproductive rate goes down, conception rate goes down, the number of calves we have an opportunity to wean next weaning season goes down as well. So there's a real connection, right, between the adaptation and nutrient requirement, cow size, lactation potential, reproductive performance, and our environment or resource base that we have to play. Okay, as we think about our system, right, what's the big driver or big message we are receiving from the pricing system currently in the beef industry? Particularly think about it from a fed cattle standpoint. We're making them smaller, bigger, 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 right? We keep making it bigger. Okay, that trickles down into our cow-calf production system from an incentive to produce heavier weaned calves or yearling cattle. But we know from the literature, this is work from Dr. Long's lab a while back, every 100 pounds of cow weight in Oklahoma only produced about 10 pounds of additional calf weaning weight. Okay, so think about the additional maintenance requirement we've got for that cow. Does 10 pounds of calf weaning weight, and you got to do it at the marginal value of gain, not the pay weight of these calves pricing. To do the math right, that 10 pounds of calf doesn't come anywhere close to paying for the nutrient requirements additional that are needed for that calf. Okay, so we've got conflicting signals that we need to be cognizant of. And unfortunately, in our system, that third of the cow-calf producers force that. Okay. So how do we implement tools? Obviously, crossbreeding is a really important piece that we discussed in here. Clear connections to profitability in our system. And remember, that's driven not only by heterosis effects, but breed complementarity. So thinking about how do we make crossbred cows that are environmentally adapted, appropriate size lactation, and convenience or economic traits that make them fit. And the value of this is huge, right? We know from the Clay Center data, about a 23% improvement in mean weight per cow exposed in an F1 terminal sire kind of system. This has a real economic value. Okay, many of you have probably seen me present this slide before. I recently updated it because calf prices are, oh my gosh, crazy, right? That means the value of heterosis goes up, right? And I've heard people say, well, calf prices are $3 for 5.5 weight calves. I don't need heterosis. Is that the craziest thing you've ever heard? Right? Because I get 23% more output for about the same inputs with $3 calf. You get the picture. Okay, so this is really important. But the number is staggering. Okay, if we think about, oh, went too far. F1 cow terminal sire system is worth just short in today's, my estimation, today's calf market, about $300 a cow a year. 300 per cow per year. Okay. Does that change the profitability of a cow-calf producer's operation? Yeah, it's huge. Okay. You can think about it in terms of changes in break-even costs. So it's about 50 cents a pound difference in break-even. You can think about it, well, how many additional dollars did straight bred calves have to produce per head? Because they don't get the benefit of additional, that system. It's actually more than the 290. It's 363 bucks to have an equivalent. So gross revenue the same from those two production systems. Okay. This is real money. Okay. And if you think about it from even 100 cow herd, which would be a modest size herd, that value difference is enough to buy a brand new Ford, Chevy, Dodge, crew cab, diesel, loaded up pickup, cash every 3 years. Even when the pickups cost $80,000, okay, on 100 cows. It dramatically changes profitability. I want to wrap up here with a couple of slides focused on this idea of making sure we select females to work in our operation, that we put our money on the best bets, okay? And the idea is that these females that are born early in the calf drop are likely from genetics that are adapted and work in our production system, right? Her mama got bred on time, calved early in the calving distribution. If she also breeds as a heifer early in the calving breeding season and calves their first calf early, she has better lifetime growth. Okay. Work from both the Meat Animal Research Center and South Dakota State demonstrates this effect, right? So this is longevity in the herd based on calving dating stafford. So if they calved with their first calf in the first 21 days, they had a substantial, almost a whole year of additional life expectancy in the South Dakota State data, or excuse me, the MARC data. The South Dakota State had first and second paired breeding season or investment cycles here, about a year difference as well. So just picking them out of the calvers that calve in the first 21 days or were bred to calve in the first 21 days adds a year of productive life to that calf. That's pretty phenomenal, right? So what does that tell you about the decision you make about the heifer that's born the last day of the calving season? I don't care what her genetics are. She needs to go work for somebody else. Okay, the odds of her lasting in your system, because remember, she's got to rebreed, right? Does she get more than once or even one opportunity in the breeding season? If you have a fixed breeding season of 90 days. Dr. Johnson's got a nice paper in our K-State stuff that says those females may not actually come into heat during your exposure if they calve the last day of the calving season. Okay? That's a management induced open. That's our fault. That's not her fault. That's our fault. Okay? So thinking about how we select these females in combination, not only of the genetic aspects, but certainly these managerial. Really important. Is a summary of some of the Meat Animal Research Center today. Bob Cushman was published, demonstrating the value of additional weight those cows produce over their lifetime. Okay, those females that calve early have a lifetime, essentially a lifetime advantage. Clay Mathis did a presentation at the Cattlemen's College that I thought was really impactful this year. And one of the components in that was this idea of contribution margin. Okay, so thinking about our systems of production scenario and thinking about the additional contribution if you have one more cow to add revenue to the system. Okay, and contribution margin is a great way to think about that. It's this idea that it was the difference between revenue and revenue less variable costs, right? So it's money we can either put to fixed costs or additional revenue that contributes to profit. I needed a really nice example, but this is a great illustration of how adding females or productivity to our system and getting an additional calf weaned or being able to run an additional cow contributes to profitability. Oftentimes, we get very sucked into individual animal performance in our business, right? We measure individual phenotypes for all kinds of things. But stepping back and thinking about the system level effect of changes in inventory and productivity is actually what drives profitability, sustainability. So with that, I'm going to stop. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today and look forward to some questions after the break.